Vala. I talked about him last time at the end of the last video. So Vala, as I said, he wrote a work in which he criticized monasticism. This didn't make him a lot of friends among many in the church hierarchy at the time. However, it did not keep him from becoming the head librarian and really, in many ways, the founder of the Vatican Library in Rome. He was one of the great early critical scholars of manuscripts. He studied manuscripts. He studied the Latin language. He actually wrote a book on the Latin language and promoted the idea of returning to what he would have considered the proper Latin of the Roman period. He also learned Greek. By this time, a lot of the guys at his level also started learning Greek. And this is actually a manuscript in the picture, not a great picture, but it is a picture of a manuscript that Lorenzo Valla translated. So he translated here the Greek text of Thucydides. You remember Thucydides was one of the Greek historians we talked about when we talked about the Greco-Roman period. So Thucydides here this is the text, and this is Lorenzo Valla's translation of Thucydides into Latin. And you can see the seal of the Papal Library here, the Vatican Library. And this actually tells us that it's this text. So I think that's pretty cool. So to put it simply, without the Renaissance popes, you don't have a lot of what was the Renaissance. They supported it, funded it. They supported the building and rebuilding of many things in Rome. A lot of the great buildings in Rome that are around today that people go look at, and a lot of the great art exist because of the Renaissance popes. Now, Renaissance popes often lived lives that were not, let's say, less than Christian. However, it is important to point out the role that they played in promoting the Renaissance itself. The popes built Rome, as I said. The popes also went out of their way to acquire manuscripts for the Vatican Library. And the Vatican Library houses one of the largest repositories of ancient and medieval manuscripts in the world today. Much of it has been digitized and online now. I've actually used a few Vatican manuscripts myself for research. Pope Pius II. This is not Pius II, Julius II. This is Julius II here. And Julius II, we're going to be talking about Michelangelo, but without Julius II funding Michelangelo, we never have the Sistine Chapel. And I'm going to be showing you pictures of the Sistine Chapel later. And also it is under Julius II that you have the beginning of the new St. Peter's Basilica that isn't completed for some time. And that's connected to the Reformation too, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the future. So let's talk about a few other of the intellectuals of the earlier Renaissance. One of these people was a man named Leonardo Bruni. Bruni represents what is often called civic humanism, where Petrarch, who would have been the generation, in the earlier period before Bruni, the father of humanism we talked about, emphasized solitude more. Under the development of humanist thought in the early 15th century, particularly in Florence. Okay, Florence was a very important place of art, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. You have the development of what's called civic humanism, and this was a return to, again, using Cicero as the foundation. Cicero as the model of the great Roman senator who promoted the state of Rome, but a republic, right? And Leonardo Bruni took up this idea. Notice also Bruni studied Greek. There was a whole group of educated individuals in Florence who studied Greek in addition to Latin. Many of these men, there were some women too, but there were some women that Leonardo Bruni actually wrote to to recommend a curriculum to them of study. So I don't want to leave them out. But in the case of the government, there were not women officially in government. In this case, many of these men who were scholars became important politicians in Florence too. The chancellor was one of the highest ranking positions in Florence. Florence was a republic, although it wasn't a democracy in a modern sense. It was a republic though, so people could vote. A certain amount of people could vote when they chose leaders from within. Now it does develop more into an oligarchy later, but during this period under the de' Medici family, but it still remained a republic. And notice Leonardo Bruni was also an historian. History as a field becomes more specific, and it was one of those fields that the humanists focused on, as we saw. All right, another guy I want to mention is Pico della Mirandola. He was also from Florence. Notice he lived after Bruni, and unfortunately he died fairly young. He got some fever, some virus probably, and died at a fairly young age. And by all accounts, this man was a genius as a young man, and he grew up in this environment in Florence. He studied multiple languages. He obviously knew his own language, Italian, but he knew Latin, Greek, Hebrew. He studied Hebrew and other ancient languages. And he was fascinated by trying to look at all these different theological and philosophical traditions and see the commonality in them. And he wanted to argue that there were nuggets or parts of universal truth in all, that God had revealed this, given this revelation to all of humanity in different ways. So he did get in a little trouble with some church authorities, but he was a brilliant man, and nobody really wanted to take him on in a public argument. That was another issue. And he famously wrote this work that is generally translated as On the Dignity of Man, in which he proclaims it's an oration, but it's written in a poetic form, and it is one of the most representative works of the idea of human beings being the apex or height of God's creation. And he really emphasizes that human beings are given free will, that they can create like God, that they have minds, that they can build things. The human beings are above all the other things in the world. So that is the focus. And that God gave humanity the world so that for their happiness and blessedness. Okay? So, important fellow, Pica della Mirandola. I do want to mention this woman. She's a fascinating writer from the time. As I said, there were other women that we know about from the upper classes who did study and were humanist. But Christine de Pizan it was a writer also. Notice the year she lived, so she's early on, and she, like Petrarch, ends up going to France because she married a French noble, and that's why her name. She was from Pisa. That's what de Pizan means. She has a French name because she goes to France. And notice the garment styles of the time too. I think that's fascinating. Here she is depicted reading. She was a famous poet and writer, so she wrote poetry, and she also wrote books in which she promoted the idea that women should also be getting education. Now, just to say something about this, during this time period, it was education for most people was still quite limited. All right, so people might say, "Oh, and women were treated differently than men." There's no doubt about that. I'm not trying to say they weren't, but I do want to point out that even your average man, and we're talking about the majority of men, would not have had the opportunity for this type of education. Okay, so that's something to point out. Her most famous book is a book that's generally translated as The City of Ladies. And in that book, she really writes a women's history. She talks about all these famous women in history. Okay, so very, very significant person. All right, so let's go ahead and get into some of the artists, or I'll introduce this topic. Now, in art history, they use the term Quattrocento and Cinquecento. My pronunciation is probably not great, but there it is. Now, when we talk about the 1400s, so that would be the 15th century in English, right? And the 1500s would be the 16th century in English. But art historians have traditionally used these terms that go back to the Italian Renaissance, the Quattrocento and the Cinquecento. Okay, so I just give you those terminologies so you'll know. You can impress your friends in the future as an educated person and say, well, studying the art of the Quattrocento, right? See, you can impress people at dinner parties and so forth. So let's talk about Florence a little bit. Florence was really the center of the artistic development, in many ways the center of the intellectual development. I mean, you can actually, people do teach whole classes on just the Renaissance. And some people teach whole semesters on just Florence, just so you understand. So that's how significant it is. So I do want to mention a couple of important individuals, and then I'm going to show you some images. One of those early, this guy's kind of a bridge figure, Giotto, or Giotto. I've heard different pronunciations, but this guy here, he's really considered a bridge figure between what we would think of as the later medieval art and towards the Renaissance. So maybe we would call him later medieval art. But what I want you to see when we see his images is how it is moving towards more of the realism and use of perspective and so forth that happens in Renaissance art. Okay. So I'm skipping ahead a bit there. Another guy named Masaccio. Masaccio didn't live that long, unfortunately. He also died in his late 20s. He was born around 1400, so you can see late 20s. I'm going to show you the example of his famous work called The Trinity. And it really demonstrates the use of perspective in art. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means, the use of perspective. The use of perspective is you draw something on a flat surface as if it looks three-dimensional, right? And you have to know the measurements and geometry to do that, right? And the last guy out of this first group, well, no, I got two more, will be Donatello, who was very well known for his sculptures. And I think I have an example of one there that I'm going to show you. And again, he's using the classical Greco-Roman model of sculpturing, and that's what he's imitating. And he's doing something new with that, though. Okay, his most famous one, he did a David, in which a David standing on the head of Goliath. And I think I have a crucifix that he made, in fact. Now Botticelli, who was very well connected in Florence also, and became very well connected to the higher ups, the people running the city, was a famous artist. And I'm going to show you some of his art. He did both classical mythology art, art based on Greco-Roman gods and goddesses, but also some Christian religious art too. So I'm going to show you that too. Why don't I end here and I'll pick up with these guys in the next video.